We're very excited to have Gerard, Byrne and Sven here with us. This is a project you've been developing for the last 2-3 years?
2.5 years.
2.5 years. So this is the 4th iteration of it. So it initially started in the Douglas Hyde was the first iteration of it. And it's been an evolving project over the last while. So do you want to give a bit of background to how it came about or how it started?
Sure, yeah. I mean, Gerard and I have been working together for a long time on projects that involve video networks, multi-screen video playback in galleries and in different spaces. And we've been thinking about these kind of conditions that we observed through the work. We had been getting to a point where we wanted to dig into it a little bit more, and we applied for a grant from the Arts Council that allowed us to kind of take a step back and develop a project that really focused on this theme and to follow through with something like this. And that was in, what, 2016?
2016.
When we started kind of writing about it and really coming up with the concept and the framework for this. And after that, following through with it has been a couple of different stages.
Yeah. So we had been working on a lot of, as Sven says, a lot of very, very complex, almost more complex than this. Exhibition, like AV setups for exhibitions to show existing works that were kind of singular and autonomous, and figuring out solutions for showing them beside one another. These are works that were not sort of made to be shown beside one another. So to show them beside one another, they all have sound and they have different spatial requirements, and it's a sort of kind of car crash, So we figured out we were really trying to address that in a very pragmatic way. And in the process of resolving what seemed like problem solving, we developed all sorts of ideas and capacities for just possibilities, but that there were possibilities that couldn't be exploited in those situations because they had very specific purposes. So the appetite to develop a project together emerged out of those situations where we were seeing this kind of latent potential that we weren't able to actually address in the format of the moment. And so, so that's where the trigger came to develop the project. And then we got funding in 16, 17, and so there was a lot of we kind of got practical about it probably midway through 17. There was a lot of speculative kind of conversations before that. So
because it's a big subject. I mean, we didn't have the title together in the beginning, but this idea of visibility and kind of our sense of what is visible changing due to the nature of kind of video culture, being surrounded by video screens, kind of dealing with video all the time, sometimes in a kind of explicit way. And I mean, maybe professionally, but also just in terms of, your normal lifestyle, always shooting video, always having video uploading to some other place and having your friend looking at it. All of that was starting to kind of feed into our ideas about this kind of screen space. And so when we wanted to boil all that down into kind of something that was palatable, an idea that was palatable and kind of communicable with other people, we realized that we wouldn't be able to achieve something like this if we were just working on our own. It wasn't something where we wanted to go out and just shoot a project and compile something together. So we had this idea of reaching out to other people. So we formed a network of other contributors. I'm sure that you guys are aware of that from reading the little text about it, but working with other people to give us video material that kind of responded to these ideas about visibility, about video culture, about kind of the apparatus. It starts with a camera and then ends with maybe this kind of situation. This is how we opened up a conversation, how we gathered all of the material that you can see formed in this exhibition.
So, and a lot of it's around the kind of mediaization of through cities, through screens, but then also like the private and public aspect of screens. Do you want to talk about a little bit about the architecture, because it's really quite specific to the exhibition as well in terms of how people move around the space, and the screens are quite specific as well.
I mean, a lot of the kind of the spatial aspect, the way that it comes together is like Gerard was talking about when we were working on his exhibitions and laying out video in different ways. A lot of what we observed and what we were interested in is what happens when you're focusing on video in front of you and something else is happening behind you, and when you can start to coordinate when things are going on and off, and you can play with your sense of vision, like kind of focus vision, but also your sense of peripheral vision, which is really quite a different thing. Something that doesn't really go, you don't usually notice it, but when you're dealing with multi-screen situations in like an airport or something like that, when all of these things are happening in synchronicity with each other, you do start to get kind of moved around by these kind of choreographies, that are set in place by whatever advertising company is kind of occupying the airport. So when we wanted to set this up, it was all about achieving that kind of format where you go into something, you have something that's happening in front of you, but also behind you, sometimes all around you. And the screens themselves are chosen very specifically. Like those are the kind of the exact format, the exact size and kind of quality of monitors that are used for signage, again, in airports and things like that. They're not really supposed to be video monitors. You're not really supposed to stand in front of them like that. Usually you see them deployed in clusters of 4 or 5 or 20, and they're all kind of stuck up right next to each other, and they're up above you. So there's something about the quality of being right up against those screens when you walk around here that's quite physical.
Yeah, I think as well, just to follow on from that is, in a very sort of direct way, there's an idea with the screens and with just the specificity of what they are, for example, that they're, as you described, that there's a way in which they address the space as a public space. And that's kind of, I think, an interesting idea in relation to the gallery space, for example, because I think that the idea of, like, in the time we live in, the idea of what constitutes public space is dynamic and is continuously being redefined. So historically, you would have assumed that the street was like a public space, but more and more, as we know in cities, what passes for like public squares are privately owned. There's different ideas of what the public sphere constitutes, for example, and also in terms of like just the bleeding overlap with the internet and with digital media and social media and all that. So I think it's interesting, like within the paradigm of art, within the context of art, which is something that I think a lot of people in the room are one way or the other interested in. I think the idea of the gallery as a public space is quite critically important at the moment, in a way that maybe it wasn't before. It's taken on a new kind of urgency, and so also because it's the interesting thing about it is it's a space of cohabitation. You go to a gallery and you look at something, and there's somebody else there looking at it at the same time, and you're in the same space looking at it with that other person, and that's not something that happens on YouTube. Or when you encounter something on YouTube or anywhere else, you look at it in a much more isolated way. So it's rarer and rarer to have this kind of idea of like an encounter with something, especially material like this, that's a kind of a public encounter, And so I think there's lots of ideas like that in play.
But the way that it works spatially and like kind of thinking about that kind of encounter, you might be watching something and having a relationship with what's happening on that screen, and maybe the only other place where that specific moment of content is playing in this system is on the other side of the room. So you might see somebody over there and understand those relationships. The more time you spend with it, you start to see that sometimes it's the same thing happening everywhere. Occasionally it becomes more isolated and fragmented. But it's kind of stranded between all those things that Gerard was just talking about there, kind of the onslaught of video culture online where you're just streaming things, choosing what you want to watch, getting directed to the next video, versus like an old kind of broadcast paradigm, which we don't get so much anymore, where we sit around and we all watch the same television show at the same time, but in different places, versus, again, the kind of space of walking down the street and having monitors that are addressing us all the time through whether it's video content or signage kind of content. So those are all the things that are kind of at play in there.
And it's working on, so the system that's within the gallery is working on algorithms as well. So similarly, when you're on your Facebook or your videos, like there is an algorithm that kind of starts coming up, showing you things that you should be watching, that you like this. But so the system that you have here has an algorithm as well that you guys have designed in terms of how the rhythm of it, how it works.
Absolutely. And it's, part of the the way we were thinking about the project and the kinds of things that we were influenced by. We were looking at a lot of multi-screen video projects from years ago, from before the internet came to be what the internet is now. And for us, thinking about the work, it is interesting to take a step back and to say, well, the internet, it is a thing, it's a network, it's a system that's kind of evolved the way that it has evolved. But that's just like one specific way it could have gone. If you look at what artists were thinking about, with multi-screen video projects and different kind of smaller networked projects years ago, before that one dominant form existed, there was a lot of speculation and optimism, kind of utopian visions of what such a form of communication could be. So our system kind of takes that step backwards. It's not online. It's all kind of isolated here, even though you can see the cables kind of twist and turn and find their way into some kind of terminus. It's all self-contained, and it's all thinking according to its own logic. And the logic that it's thinking with is expressed in a voiceover. So the voiceover, you start to hear a voice cutting into things, talking about the actions, the attitudes, the sense, what it's thinking at the moment when it makes an action. Because it's not just playing videos according to like a preset system. It's editing into video as it's occurring. So it's making
not just a playlist.
It's not just a playlist, right? So it's very actively like cutting video, starting other video, and telling you about doing that. And the things that it says aren't just like, I know what I'm doing, you're going to see this now. It's also saying things like, I don't know what's going to come next. This is frustrating. This isn't complete. We should have more of this. So it's thinking, it's like an uncertain network versus a certain network, which is maybe the way we often find ourselves dealing with the internet and the interactions we have with it as a kind of given. This is kind of questioning itself. It's a bit,
And I guess then as well with the wiring, it's kind of making the invisible visible, because a lot of the times where all those cables are, they're in the seabed or they're like that, but you're bringing those kind of physical things back into the gallery space.
Yeah, the sort of motif of the cable is quite important because, obviously it's extremely conspicuous physically in the space, but also we did get some, maybe it was because of the way that we approached our contributors and the types of ideas that we discussed with them, but we did get some material, some video footage that was somehow about cabling and about laying these like deep, like underwater cables, like telecommunication cables. We got several contributions that were specifically related to that activity, and which were quite interesting, I think, because I think in a way it goes back to one of the core ideas of the project, which is that, like at the very beginning, we were interested in the way that because of screens and because of the complete saturation, not only of screens, but also of cameras, and everything is networked to everything else, right? Then what's happened culturally, I think, it's a sort of a broad statement, but what's happened is actually redefined our idea of what an image is, right? So we used to understand an image, like, as I say, if you think back to your own childhood, when everybody, I look at the generations of people that sort of roughly kind of similar generations of people in the room, I can generalize and say, you probably feel like you have very few photographs of your childhood, right? Because actually there wasn't many photographs made at that point, obviously compared to today. But what that meant actually was that at that point, the culture around images was a culture of scarcity. Yeah. Right? There wasn't many. They were valuable. There was a type of scarcity and a kind of precarity around image making, right? Yeah. And that affected what we thought of when we looked at an image, right? We had a different emotive and kind of cultural relationship with an image. Whereas now, we don't have that relationship with imagery anymore, because imagery is just it's in streams and it's everywhere. And if I delete it, then I can always get a copy from my mate, and we have a profoundly different relationship to it. So we were interested in that, and we were interested in how it's the idea of the network that's actually changed that above all else. But the paradox, in a way, is that it's extremely, even as it's changed our idea of an image, it's very difficult to make an image of a network. It's really difficult to actually make like, for example, if you had an idea, I'm going to make a film about the internet, It's a really difficult thing to do, right?
Well, you see films that people make about the internet, and they're like, you see like data storage, these kind of server rooms. So there's a lot of ideas. There's kind of visual tropes that we have for understanding and representing these things. These kind of nodes, little.
Well, the language around it as well, where everything's up in the cloud, whereas actually it's not.
Yes.
It's in a location. It's in
Yeah.
a place.
Exactly.
So I mean, and there's all these metaphors like the cloud, because to figure out to have to make people understand it somehow, right, or give them some working understanding of it. So I mean, it's that paradox that it's very difficult to visualize or to make visible, we'll say, the network or the internet, right, or whatever that is that we live with every day now. And so that in a way was very much kind of led into the idea of the project. And we realized, like, no matter how much time or how much money we had, we probably couldn't, just the two of us, actually make something that was kind of an adequate reflection of what we're talking about is essentially a set of conditions, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why we came up with this sort of structure where we'd in a way make a network, which was a network of contributors. And the work, in a way, takes the form of a network.
Yeah.
I mean, the cables, it's literally like a model of a network.
And it's finite as well, because you were talking about that it can still keep growing, that the work actually doesn't finish, that you can still have more contributors to it.
I mean, in its most radical suggestion, as you suggested the other day, I mean, potentially, like in the next iteration, we could actually just get rid of all this material and start with completely new material. It would still be the same work.
Yeah, it's not about seeing the one specific thing in it to understand what the work is, or a series of things. It's the way things occur, the relationships between them, the relationships maybe that you begin to have when you're watching something that's being created that way. And so the idea of we could work with the protocol that we've established and a system as a kind of armature, and to fill it with a completely different form of video content, it would still be the same work to a certain extent.
So you're not prioritizing the images or the videos. That's not the main thing. It's
no, but at the same time, I mean, there are moments that are very palpable. Like somebody we were on the radio last night, and what was the name of the filmmaker that was also on the radio show? This
Filmmaker
from Derry. I can't remember his name. He's a really interesting guy. But as we walked out, he was talking about a project or something he was working on that involved like thinking of what are there iconic images anymore? Are there things that stand out like in this kind of image-saturated culture? And it's interesting, we've obviously spent a lot of time with this, installing it, compiling it, but when you install it and suddenly it's happening around you, and it's happening in a different way than we've ever seen it every time it happens, and you look at all this and you're like, what does rise to the surface as an iconic image? What are the forms, or like what are the commonalities, and what comes out? What punctures the the flow of all these different things? And I don't have an easy answer to that, but there are certain things that are recurring. There's definitely recurring themes in it, and some of them have a lot of gravity. And I think when we talk to people about it, or even between the two of us, there's certain things that we like when they happen, little intersections between two things that really make sense together, and that's nice. So it does start to speak through that, through the way things get layered, and through those, you can learn those associations. It's an interesting way of watching. I mean, that's why it could be repurposed almost as a tool for visualizing a video archive. You'd never be able to accomplish this sitting on a screen and just kind of clicking through things and scrolling through it, but just to have it around you is quite interesting.
And what about authorship? We talked a bit about that earlier today, in terms of you're the editors, and then their contributors contribute to you, but you have a very specific contract with them around the work as well.
Yeah, so we had to get all legal on it, so to speak, which wasn't uninteresting. But we had to do that because we were very clear in our minds that we were making a singular artwork. We weren't making like a video platform or a curated selection of contemporary art, video art, or a video biennale or anything like that. We were making an artwork. And so in a way, we had to sort of safeguard that as the kind of outcome of the project. And so I've already kind of given a rationale for why we decided to work with this big network of people. And we had great conversations with a lot of different people, and tremendous generosity from people. we had some funding, so we were able to pay people some fees. Everybody got paid a fee for the contribution, but it's you know, how do you put a value on it? But we had to, so we had to kind of draw out like the details of these relationships, and so basically then we had to work with a lawyer who didn't at first really understand really what we were trying to do. It's complicated, right? And then in the end, we came up with what seems like, you know, a good solution for everybody. And but it means that the work has integrity. I mean that this is the work, and it's that, you know, and it's not kind of. I mean, although in practice, actually, it has of course a real modular character in terms of how it shuffles through material, and but in principle, at least, it has a pool of material that it works from. And the pool of material isn't, you know, it's set. It can be added to, but it shouldn't really be taken from, if you know what I mean.
I mean, just can you imagine if every time you showed the work, you had to go back and check with everybody who you invited to contribute to say, is it okay to use this again? You know, that would be really quite difficult, especially because there's a pool of material that gets kind of recompiled, but there's also little kind of sequences that we've composed where there are those, you know, those kind of coincidences do happen over and over again. So it would be sad to have to lose, you know, one thing or another every time we showed it. It would be very, very difficult. And I think, like Gerard said, I mean, so the structure that we had in terms of working with other people is we contacted maybe 10 people who we referred to as our editorial board, which is maybe not the right way of referring to them, but that's what we said. And each of them, we talked to them about what the project was about, and we chose them because maybe we had worked with them before, or they were researching something or working with something that was similar to this idea. And then each of them thought of maybe between 5 and 10 people to contact and to introduce to us. So we built up our kind of network of people that way. And all of those conversations were really substantial. And some of them really did contribute to us forming this, you know, the structure of the work. So it is, you know, that was a very important, you know, stage of evolving the form. But at this stage, it does become kind of consolidated, which is important.
And how do you see it evolving from here then? Is it something you're...
Yeah, no, I'd absolutely like to show it again. It's every time we show it, it's different because, I mean, the spatiality of it is quite different. You can imagine here in Void, I mean, you only got to see it for a second coming in, but it occupies the 2 galleries, and then there's that kind of third gallery where you start to get a little bit deeper into the system, and you see a screen that's revealing a little bit of what it's thinking in its own language, in its own time. And you see a bit of the infrastructure, but it's been different every time we've showed it. That's one thing that's quite exciting about trying to put it in different places. We've also, like, even from the beginning when we thought about the idea, because so many of the references for it aren't things that come from a gallery space, but things that come from a public space. We would really like to, you know, position it somewhere that's a bit more public at some stage, where you really intersect with different people who are just passing it in a very different mind frame than when you come to a gallery. I think it has a lot of potential that way.
I mean, yeah, I think that's one of the tricky aspects of the work as well, is that we come to realize that, I mean, you know, thanks to the interest of, you know, you and Georgina and the other spaces that we've shown the work in, you know, we've been able to put the work together, and we've been able to kind of, as I say, give it an outing, and it's been fantastic. But in a way, there is some. I mean, even though, as I said earlier, you know, I enjoy the way the work tries to assert this concept, this idea that the gallery is a public space. There is a sense in which there's still a tension in those relationships, because I think, of course, especially with media art, people have become acclimated to the idea that you go into the gallery and there's a video work on and it's 20 minutes long, or it's 6 minutes long, or maybe it's 50 minutes long, but somehow it has a finite duration, and and there's a certain sort of expectation that you can bring to bear in the situation. And we're all very sort of inculcated into, like, engaging with work on those sort of terms. But this work doesn't work like that. And in a way, it sort of maybe disappoints those expectations on a certain level. And that's because it's actually working at a whole different kind of temporality. You know, it on one level, it's absolutely, what I enjoy about it is that it exists in the present very much. It's not concerned about how long or short it is, or really what point it is in its arc, in its loop. It's very much like from the present to the present to the present. And I think that the little screen on the wall with this readout, this log, in a way underscores that idea of like a kind of a real time. You know, there's a quality to that, and then and there's also a way in which it's a kind of it's a different scale, it's a bit different temporal scale in a way, and in a way maybe it's something that in some ways would be more interesting, or would be interesting certainly to try it outside the paradigm of the gallery, we'll say. But at the same time, it's been great to do it in the gallery, and I think that it does, as you touched on, the work really does draw on. You know, it really identifies with a history of early video art, multi-channel video art that was kind of engaged with cybernetics and engaged with lots of ideas before the internet came along. You know what I mean? And so in that sense, that's an art tradition. You know.
And we talked a bit about what you wanted the viewer, the participants, or people who come to see take away from that, right? And you were talking about that it's not about them spending hours with it. It's more about being with it for a short space of time, and then that's the
taking
experience.
that as the reality of the work. I mean, you can't see all of it. We haven't seen all of it. That's certainly not the way to learn it or to be in it. And I think that it is, because it's moving. Again, it has different kind of moods. Sometimes it's in a bit of a static mood, and it plays very slow, quiet things. You can go in there and it's dead quiet sometimes, and other times you're in the middle of a factory with sparks going on around you. You see the colors. The screens are so bright that in a dark space like that, the walls are kind of pulsating with the yellows and things like that. It's really, it really fills the space. So all of those conditions and all of those little changes, that's what you encounter as the work, I think, and like Gerard was talking about earlier, the idea of other people being in that space with you maybe at the same time, walking back and forth between things, finding different perspectives, and realizing that they all kind of contribute to this, to seeing it and to hearing it. I mean, it's really quite a powerful work. Sometimes there's a big low frequency speaker that occasionally there's something that really activates that, and you can really have a bit of a jump in the space that just wakes you up a little bit.
I think in a way the sort of like a good way to engage is, if it's possible, of course it's all down to feasibility, but I think to like come and go and visit different times, that's really that's a kind of a good way of engaging it, but there's no point in kind of like setting a duration, because duration isn't really it doesn't work on those terms, I think. In a way.
Because this iteration I thought was there's a lot of musicality to it, because when I saw it in the Douglas Hyde, it had a very different sensibility than it does here, I think.
There's different components that are just surfacing a little bit more at this stage, and there's a few. I guess it's because this is what we remember. When we hear music, we remember the tune, we remember the beat or something like that. So even though it might be occurring just as frequently as something that's a bit more abstract, it stands out. It becomes a little bit like the identity of it. But I agree, there's a few very memorable little sequences. Musical sequences, yeah.
So, will I open it up to the floor if anyone has any questions about the work? I know not everyone's got to see it or experience it yet, but...
I was interested in this idea of the present and time, and just thinking about, if there's a will, if the work is, and let's go back to early science fiction and get into how.
Yeah.
So if how is the program.
Yeah.
And this idea of an infinite present.
Yeah.
Because that would be the natural progression for something like this, to infinitely reproduce itself.
Yes.
Somewhere in the middle of, where infinite people are walking, in public space.
That's what the voice serves as, isn't it?
Yeah. No, that's a good way of thinking about this kind of condition, which is, it's never going to achieve that condition, of course, because there's all these particularities, but that's what the voiceover starts to bring into it. But it's not I'm trying to think if there's a sense of time or temporality. It's not linked to the time of the day or anything like that. trying to think of the voiceovers. Does the voiceover ever say anything about?
The voiceover is very much in the present tense. It's
Very
infinite
much in the
present. I
present.
mean, I think what's interesting about it is that you do have kind of different temporalities though that coexist, because the image, right? The image infers its own temporality, right? I mean, if you have film that's like, if you film footage that is like really old, it's from the 1920s or something, right? Well, that, apart from anything else, it infers like, well, it's 80 years old, or it's 90 years old, or whatever. Or you've got something else that's, you know, that's from 6 months ago. But, you know, images are always kind of bound to time, right? At some level. So there's those registers, we'll say. But then there is also this kind of shuffling, right? This kind of like present tense, this kind of relativism, this kind of activity, you know. I mean, one way that I have described the project before is to say that it's this kind of machine, right? It's kind of networked. It's kind of like an editing machine, or almost an art, you know. And it's literally going through this material in real time, and it's kind of sorting. It's connecting things. It's comparing things. It's separating out things. It's duplicating things. And there's a voice. The voiceover, in a way, actually underscores that, because the voiceover, you know, in this kind of HAL 2000 way, it sort of embodies. It gives a voice. It's an active embodiment. It sort of embodies, you know, the system, you know, and
it kind of roots the work as well.
Yeah, it becomes a kind of protagonist somehow. There's a sort of protagonist who's doing these activities, who's kind of organizing this material and putting this over there and putting that over there and now putting that over there and switching to this, and it's just kind of ongoing.
But they're also it's aware of the space as well. There are occasionally like things that address the physicality of the space and the viewer, the listener within the space as well, which is, so can kind of, that's what we realize with the voice, is the voice can move between those different levels, and it helps to underscore or to make us think about, like, when you're inside of a network, like, you know, where are you in the network? Are you, like Gerard was saying, like, are you engaged? Are you bound to the specific video, the material that you're watching, or are you kind of stuck within a different register within the kind of the lighting conditions of the gallery? Or sometimes it refers to something that's happening outside of the gallery. You know, it even has little bits of a clue about these things. It knows it's in void right now, for instance, for sure. If you listen for a while, it definitely knows it's in void. It knows it's in Derry, definitely.
What are the parameters of the algorithm? And is the algorithm also manages the voiceover?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the voiceover is tied to the kind of the moments of action when it's deciding to do things. The screen is a little bit lower level, and it really just belches out every little thing that it's doing. But the voiceover is talking about when something's stopping and starting, kind of when it's in between things, when it's about to make a choice about what happens next. But it is, I mean, to go back to this idea of the kind of continuous present, it brings up, and we always have this, when we talk about algorithms and we talk about artificial intelligence, there's, you know, your brain starts to, you try to connect things and figure out a structure for it. It's not really, it's questioning things, but it's not determined for the viewer, you know, how smart it is. You know, it doesn't really know what's going to happen next. It has some things that it likes to do. It has certain days where it does more of one thing than another.
But that's all based on a set of, a set of parameters, right? I mean, in a way, you know, we talked a little bit about this earlier today when at lunchtime we were talking. I was saying that there's a weird sort of strategy, in a way, artistic strategy that's in play in the production of the work, where there's certain decisions that we have delegated, right? There's acts of delegation. So in terms of like the combinations of what material you see on screens at a given time, right? There's an act of delegation on our part there, right? Sven has written code that's given this system the capacity to make those choices, right? So that's an act of delegation on our part. There's another act of delegation, which is the act of delegation whereby instead of us filming all the material that's in the work, we delegated that activity to other people. So there's all these sort of gestures of delegation, and at the same time, there's other kind of levels of we made decisions about delegation, if you know what I mean.
But it's quite collaborative too, though. Delegation sounds a bit
Yeah, well, I don't mean delegation in the sense of you go and do that. No, but I mean in the sense of like you give away a certain amount of power, right, at some level. But that's a very carefully considered choice, right? And obviously it's because there's something to gain in that act of giving away. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So that's sort of unorthodox in a way in terms of the idea of authorship, right? We tie authorship to an act of control and an act of decision making, right? And so to give that away is kind of in a way I'm not saying it's unprecedented by any means, but it's non-orthodox, we'll say.
I would say I would keep with the word delegation and say that it also involves the audience, the viewer, that way, because I think when people we have these questions, or when we have talks about it and we talk about the system, when we start getting into the fact that it might be intelligent enough to make little decisions about what's happening. Well, we're all used to ideas like this. We live in this kind of system, and usually something's watching us and making decisions based on our behavior. So people are like, so is it watching us? Does it know that we're here? Like, does our behavior, does our passage through the room influence its mood and things like that? And to a certain extent, I mean, it doesn't have any sensors that know that you're there. Right? I know, exactly. That's so 2.0. But at the same time, like, it makes you question those things, and like that's part of being in it, is to kind of reflect on that and to walk back out into the, you do become a little bit like, you don't have a cable coming off you, but you could. You could.
Oh, Brian.
It's a network of collaborators. So the work is the network, it's not really the English material. And you were to get rid of all the English material, the work would still exist in the material. But if you were to invite the network again to send you new material, do you think you would get the same material?
Interesting question.
Can I respond to that? I think that's a great kind of alternative scenario, because I think one of the difficulties and frustrations of developing the project on those terms is, it's a commonplace situation it happens to us all in life, is you're asking somebody to contribute to something. They don't really, nobody really knows exactly what it's going to be like, let alone the contributor, right? So you're asking them to make choices and to make considerations in a slightly blind kind of scenario. So I do think actually it's really interesting to think about, if our contributors could see how this plays out, then I think that would be really interesting to ponder. But I think the counterpoint, of course, is just the logistics. It's not only is it a difficult enough project to install, although we've actually got pretty proficient at it at this point, but it's actually even a difficult project to document, to mediate, like in a visual sense. So in that sense, and our contributors are by our ambition global. So there's a lot of people. I mean, we keep people updated. Oh, the project's in Void and Derry, and and then we send them some photos. And
we've had a few people intersect with it who, coming to see it in different iterations. Which, I mean, certainly like in Douglas Hyde in the beginning, there were a few folks there who were, contributors, and that was great to have those conversations. I remember a few specific moments, even the piece that just ended, the component that just ended there. I remember talking with the filmmaker who contributed at the top of the stairs there, looking down at it, and he just got it. He was delighted, But some people, even when you just talk to them about like that it was going to be a multi-screen project, maybe if they work with multi-screen kind of video within their own practice, they would know how to contribute to that in a specific way. There's a few things that really operated like on that structural level from the get-go, and we could kind of integrate them spatially that way. But I think definitely in terms of like the thematics that people address, even if they just saw a few still images, to see a few of the things that have surfaced would spark very different conversations. because it's like a form of anthropology, you know, to see this thing unfolding. It's like, you know, if you ask, what's the question we asked all these people? How did they follow through with it? What did they contribute? And how does it get kind of distilled here? You know, you can stand in it and watch it that way as a good sense of like, what do we think of? I was even thinking about that the other day when, you know, we were talking about the radio interview. It's a good question to kind of put to people, like, well, if you were contributing to this, like, what would you put in it? What would you want to put in it to help kind of provoke these questions, to keep it thinking like that?
Was there, just kind of following on from that question, was there a theme or a narrative to the content that you requested? Or when you were putting this together, was there kind of a narrative? Like, there's obviously the process,
Yeah.
and then multiple images are really important.
Yeah.
Is there kind of a story?
That it was this kind of theme of visibility, and of that. So, and we kind of, you know, we made a short text. We really brought it down. We talked a tiny bit about the kinds of situations, the conditions that we're working in or that we're living in. We pointed out a few specific examples of things. A little nod to the older video art projects, but also just bringing up a few different directions to kind of get people seeing that it wasn't about this, it was definitely about taking it. And then we Skyped a lot of people and had, you know, some very long conversations. We had a few people who thought they wanted to give one thing in the beginning and then changed their mind and really revised what they contributed. A few people who gave new material. That's actually an interesting that came out of this, was asking for material. Again, we weren't asking for artworks or finished things. It was looking for scraps in a different way, and that was really interesting.
Yeah, we really, in some levels, that was kind of a moment of struggle, right? Because, you know, a lot of people think like, oh yeah, well, you know, here's my latest 8-minute video work. And I'm like, you know, and then you're into, you know, you have to be diplomatic, but you're trying to be clear, and you're trying to say, well, it's not actually really what we're trying to do here. We're trying to, you know, but people got it. We had like, I mean, one or two people who actually, we've only really had one instance of somebody who actually withdrew their material from the project. But even that, there was no acrimony around it. It was quite, it was actually somebody who was a major contributor to the project on other levels. And it was, they had a project they'd made, which was a really important project for them. And they had very specific ambitions for it, and then they just kind of realized that they just didn't want, they wanted to retain the material and use the material in another way. That was completely understandable. And, you know, that can happen like now and again, but it's not something that, like, if that was a kind of, we had to safeguard against that being a kind of widespread phenomenon, because then the work would just fall apart at some level. So it just wouldn't be tenable. So we have to find a balance, you know, in these situations. But
that was definitely a big part of making the work, though, was talking with people, you know, really bringing people into it.
Yeah, we really had, like, it wasn't just a kind of, as I always describe it, a Ponzi scheme, you know, where you kind of, you get a bunch of emails from somewhere and you write to like 80 emails, you want to give us a 6-minute video, blah, blah, upload it to, we send it, you know. We really didn't want to make an art project on those terms. We wanted to make an art project that really did involve, you know, as you were asking, really did like involve like a conversations with people.
But it was your networks that you were using as well.
So, you know, and I think we would like to, you know, if we were to add more, which is an aspiration, we would like to work from kind of different networks. And, you know, we are quite heavily reliant on artists and sort of creative, like experimental filmmakers, because they're our most viable networks. But it would be really nice actually to tap into a little bit more. We've tapped in a little bit, but it would be nice to tap in to a greater degree into like networks of people who work with video material, for example, within science or within
archives.
Or also within like industrial applications, because it's really prevalent, you know. And that would be really interesting. Or, you know, we have a little bit of connection with visual anthropology, but that could go much further. So.
What did the lawyer call it in the end?
Yeah, call it in terms of like, how did they refer to the work or whatever?
What was the term they came up with?
Well, it was actually just down to understanding that it was an artwork, and then setting the kind of terms around the copyright of what, you know, the rights around the material that was being given. So it was very, there were actually two contracts, one for the editors who worked to kind of link us to different contributors, and then the contributors who gave us material had a different contract. And most of it from our perspective again was to make sure that that they were included in, for instance, they're included in the sale of the artwork. If the artwork sells, they get a cut of it. It's kind of equal that way. But also so that it was kind of shown that we gave them a fee and they gave us material, and that makes it kind of an easy transaction. It's really straightforward in the end after the language and all the little clauses were put in place. Like Gerard was saying in the beginning when we were speaking with the lawyer, she didn't understand it in the sense that like she was thinking about all the right questions, so it wasn't just a given to take it as what we were saying. She was thinking like, will this, like how am I going to bring in all of that? And so it was actually, we learned a lot from that process.
Yeah.
It wasn't unenjoyable. Everything happened at once when we were producing the work, so that aspect was at one stage really quite full on, just in terms of programming, getting contributors together, talking to the lawyer, getting ready for the first exhibition. That was all quite a moment of work, of just thinking in different ways. But each aspect of it really, really did inform the project, I would say.
Yeah.
I thought the line in the introduction about the expectation of visibility was really interesting. And the kind of, that idea that people act differently when they know that they're being watched. Or kind of with the saturation of video, like having permission to film people as well. Did you come across any of that in, say, the content? So obviously you have permission from contributors, but they have permission from all of the people.
There's one or two specific cases that were, one very interesting case, where somebody wanted to contribute material, not that they hadn't shot, but that was captured by border cams in America-Mexico border. So we talked about it, and they found a website where it was a website that kind of called on like citizen activists in America to watch these cameras so they could like click when they saw somebody crossing over or getting in a raft. And I was like, man, that's some sordid stuff. And so I went on the website. We didn't even talk to a lawyer. I was like, yeah, this is going to be complicated. I read through the website and the clauses on it. But then I dug a little bit more into the website, and this is totally fascinating. They weren't live feeds at all. They were looped videos playing on a website with a kind of click here to like catch the person. So there was always somebody in a freaking raft going across the border. You can see this stuff out there. It's like a video game. So I don't know. And maybe it was live at some stage, and then whatever company was. I looked. I researched it a little bit. And that material did find its way not directly through that contributor, but kind of manifested in here. So there's a few little instances like that. There's a little bit of stock footage that had some interesting
I was just thinking of that.
conditions.
Yeah. Somebody gave us stock footage. They didn't, they went to a video stock production house and they licensed some stock footage and gave it to us and that. So there's different kind of other kind of
There's little transgressions in it.
Transgressions
Really?
or as I say, other types of delegation as well.
You got JPEG documents as well, where they wouldn't actually
some people
film,
did.
right?
Some people gave us just like still images.
Yeah.
Like
Or even documents, like you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like printed documents almost. We got some. Didn't you get some Super? Like some film? Didn't somebody send film? Or was there was talk about somebody sending.
No, it was a couple of people actually who gave us material that was on film. It needed to be transferred to video and various, a couple of things like that. Oh, there was one that was 16mm film that had been shot years and years ago, and never even transferred to video. And then somebody else had something on a very weird old video format, from kind of student days kind of thing. And so we had to somehow try and transfer that.
So like a smart contributor would be thinking to themselves, like, this is a cheap way to get my material transferred. Give it to these guys. Like, thanks, guys. Yeah, exactly.
Any more questions?
If the network is the artwork, would you delegate the network to somebody else to use it?
You mean to populate it kind of with different material or something like that? to deploy it?
Yeah, I think that's not a bad idea. It's an interesting idea, but I think in a way, it brings up other interesting questions. So when an artist makes an artwork, does the artwork have kind of autonomy at that point, or is it still somehow tied to the artist? Because that's in a way what's at stake in your question, right? Yeah. You're kind of probing the degree to which, you know, we somehow still kind of regulate and control the work. It's a legitimate question in the sense that there is I think every artist recognizes that there's a sort of process of kind of extracting yourself from something you've made, right? Yeah. And on that level, right, it's, you know, we also have to go through that process. But I think at a certain point, you know, you hope that the work has a kind of autonomy, right? And in that sense, we don't necessarily need to be around. Do you know what I mean? And potentially, you know, somebody else could have some, could input into, like, its, you know, for example, even its physical installation in a certain scenario. We were just pondering today the idea of, like, the work being installed somewhere in our absence, right? Yes. And we kind of like, what would that be like? Could be good. But then there's other types of input as you're kind of, I think, inferring, right? Other levels of influence will say that,
Comes down into the specification of a little bit, you know, like to tie off all of those levels at which there could be an input or influence, and to go through it and to say what is possible and what isn't possible, and what would you do to make it not the artwork anymore? Is there some video that you could put in there that it would not be this, you know? I'm not sure if there is such a video kind of archive that you could put into it for it not to seem like itself, because its behavior and maybe like a few very basic rules of how that specific equipment is deployed does have a form, you know, does have a recognizable form, even in a different space. I mean, it's been in very different spaces. Really.
Yeah. I sense your question is a kind of a soloist type question, right? It's about the idea that the work might, there might be a set of rules or conventions, and then the work could be made elsewhere or remanifest according to those set of conventions, right?
Or even the idea that there is a network of contributors.
Yeah.
The fact that you set up a network that those contributors feed into.
Yeah.
Those two are not necessarily, I mean, those are independent of each
other.
Yeah. So there could be, you could deploy that relationship.
I think at the end of the day, like, it's a really interesting question. I think at the end of the day, for me, what that question comes down to, it's not really about technicalities, of course. It's about attitude, right? Yeah. It's about a kind of philosophical attitude, right? Or just attitude, we'll say. And I mean, with Solowit, that was all about attitude, right? It was like anybody could make the drawing once you have the set of, you know, instructions, you know.
Yeah, but the difference, though, is that if you think of it as an artwork, this is a really interesting question. If you think of it as an artwork and it sells to a museum, how is it shown in 50 years?
In other words, does it have to be shown with this specific kind of configuration, or or should they show it with by remanifesting the kind of invitation kind of relationship? That's true that would be a different. I mean, it's interesting, really interesting to think about all this. Part of when we originally kind of, we should think about these things. No, when we made the artwork originally, when we kind of formed the core concept of it, it had a little bit more of a sense of a time span to it. We were trying to kind of cover a certain amount of time, and the idea is that this thing would always be going, almost like it is right now. It's always going, and that becomes something that continued. Again, it's the continuous present thing, so that in 50 years, it's doing that right now, that kind of idea. So in that sense, it would be tied to the specifics of what we've already achieved, but to open it up to a whole new network at that stage. Yeah, it is.
But I mean, the other thing, I think they're all, I mean, great questions. I feel like, you know, I probably need to get on with the opening, right? But I will just say, just on that, Sarah, is that, you know, some of those questions are also questions that are not, they're actually, interestingly, they're kind of common questions. They're questions that anybody who makes a media-based artwork and houses it in a museum or sells it to a museum or otherwise it goes into a museum, those questions are, in one or other set of terms, I mean, I've had to deal with those questions in relation to other works in a way. Like, well, what would the work be? What if we don't have DVD players in 50 years' time?
But you've often sold the objects with the work, so that becomes part of the work.
Yeah, but I mean, you have to decide, like, well, what is the work? You know, if it has to be, if none of this technology is here, what would the work still be? Yeah. Right. So they're quite practical questions, and they're not uncommon actually.
There's more and more people working to uncover the answers to all those questions as certain machines die.
Could this work like a kind of weather system or something? It could blow up anything. Say you plug it onto Facebook or anything, any kind of like
media video.
Gallery, and
it
would make a storm with it, really dry, sunny day. Is that what this works?
The weather would be great. It'd be great to get the weather in there, actually. I think that is actually a missing element. It'd be great to have a weather update, you know? Because, you know, when you're in the gallery, it's good to know what it's going to be like when you go outside, right?
It's going to control everything.
But I mean, I think it's certainly. I mean, the work has a kind of sponge-like character, right? It could soak up a lot of different things, right? And as we sort of inferred, you could kind of wring out the sponge. You know, if you go with the metaphor, you could squeeze out the sponge and you could start again with very different material. But I think at the same time, it's a balance to find, right? On the one hand, you want it to have this kind of capacity to regenerate itself or be not overly attached to one set of material. And on the other hand, there is also a kind of specific quality to the material. There's like the conversations that we had with people weren't arbitrary. They were quite specific and considered. And I think that, and in a way, that's probably what makes it an artwork, right? Is that you retain these kind of nuanced kind of considerations where we're trying to balance this with that, right? And that's kind of nuanced in a way. So there was one more.
You chose a set of collaborators. You didn't make an open call.
No.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
we didn't do an open call, which would have been an obvious, much easier in a way.
There were a number of things that we could have done that would have been a lot easier.
We have one.
Yeah.
About the soundtrack.
Yeah.
You know, sitting here and hearing this soundtrack.
Yes.
Obviously, did the contributors contribute that, or just the images? And also, then how do you select from that? Because you've got multiple images going on, but yet obviously one soundtrack in the room at any given point.
Oh no, many soundtracks in a given point. So each, it sounds like one.
Very simple, you know, or not simple, but you know, one sound
Yes.
essentially coming.
Yes.
Like the endless 5-1.
Yes.
And this particular sound.
This one here now.
So how, and then obviously in between you talked about announcements.
Yes.
So did you put those? Can you just talk a little bit
about how all of that gets composed? So everybody contributed video material which might have had sound or might not have sound. Some people thought about it more as more of an important part and talked about that with us and asked how the speakers were going to work and everything. So each of the monitors has one speaker with it, and then there's kind of a larger system with one speaker in each room and the large kind of subwoofer. That's where the kind of voiceover comes out, and occasionally that's addressed also, like you were saying, like with a kind of singular soundtrack to really fill the space. At other times, you know, depending, again, some of this is kind of scripted by us, sometimes it's actually just being composed by the machine, and we've never heard it before. Sometimes the machine chooses 14 different things, plays them on 14 different monitors. Each of them might have a soundtrack, and out it goes. So that, you know, it's quite chaotic or whatever. I get sometimes really, really quite loud, but.
And what about the voice you say that it introduces something? Did you record that, or how did you devise that?
We did record that. the voiceover artist is in the room as we speak. I won't look in the right direction, but yes, we've done several stages of voiceover, which are and there's different. The machine has different kind of pools of voice commands to deploy at different moments. So some of them are like actions that are really tied to like edits and things like that, and others are the more speculative things that it's thinking in between decisions, you know? So it's thinking by voicing these things and you hearing them. You know, if you spent enough time with it, sometimes it says the same thing twice in a row. It's a robot in that sense. It's not, you know, it's not trying to become human or something like that. I'd be curious after you listen to it a bit more to see what kind of patterns you find. You know? Yeah.
Okay, well maybe we'll leave it there. Thank you, Gerard. Thank you, Sven. It's great to have an insight into the work. Thank you very much.